Hello, this is William. This is the Historical Podcast Show, and today we will be talking about an alternative history event for World War One. With us, we have.
Hello, I'm Andy.
And I'm Isaac.
All right, excellent. So, we're going to be discussing World War One and specifically an alternative event where Germany wins World War One. So, some background knowledge that's necessary to understand the scenario and just necessary if you want to understand the nuances of World War One, is that the German Empire formed in 1871, and it was pretty big. It was like the Prussian Empire. And no, to quote Dan Carlin from Hardcore History, it was like the Prussian Empire, but on steroid. Um, it was big. It was a big deal. It was big news. Um, and it was very dominant in Europe, and it had a very belligerent Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm the second. He did not play well with the other monarchs of Europe, and so he quickly made a bad name for himself. And so a lot of nations didn't particularly like Germany after it formed. Britain had concerns over Germany's growing navy. France didn't like Germany because they had conflicting claims over Alsace-Lorraine. Russia didn't like Germany simply because Kaiser Wilhelm II managed to alienate Germany from Russia. But that being said, Germany was still in a very prominent position in European politics at that point because it had the Prussian army, but with the large population of the rest of Germany and their industry to back it as well. And so further on into the century, an alliance between France and Russia formed called the Entente Cordiale. And this was a defense pact, but what it actually was just an anti-Germany pact. And likewise, Germany also would eventually have a faction called the Central Powers. And in this quote-unquote faction aligned with Germany was the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Italy. And so leading up to World War One, the point of divergence from our scenario to real life is that during the Russo-Japanese War, there was an event where Russian ships fired on British ships, mistaking them for Japanese ships. And in real life, the Russian diplomats very quickly got on the telegrams. They very quickly phoned in with the British. They were like, that was an accident. We didn't mean to do that. Let's keep this peaceful. And they were able to smooth out the incident. And all that happened is that Russian ships were limited from crossing the Suez over the course of the war. And however, in this scenario, we're going to suggest that Britain uses this as an excuse to go to war with Russia, which to give this, which is not totally preposterous to suggest, because Britain had a few solid reasons as to why they would want to go to war with Russia. For one, the two still, despite the fact that the competition in the Middle East between the two empires had mostly ended, this two still had some enmity towards each other over conflicting spheres in the Middle East. Furthermore, Britain had concerns over Russian expansion in Asia. And finally, Britain actually had an alliance with Japan. So for this scenario, we're suggesting that Britain declares war on Russia in response to this. And France, not wanting this war on Russia, who was a member of the Entente Cordiale, to escalate any further, joins in the war on the side of Russia. And eventually, the two empires of France and Britain not wanting this war to escalate, because really this was a war over Manchuria and Korea, which had nothing to do with the two. The two would eventually sign a peace, and it would be mediated by the U.S., just like it was in our timeline. And most likely, the treaty would still favor Japan. However, there'd be some wider geopolitical consequences for this. For one thing, the British and the French would be on much worse terms than they would before. The British would have their dislike of the Russians reaffirmed, which was bad because previously relations between Britain and Russia had been on a positive trend. Um, and so in this scenario, Britain would exit the Entente Cordiale, which they had just recently joined before the Russo-Japanese War. And fast forwarding, World War I breaks out. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated by a Serbian terrorist Gavrilo Princip. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Germany declares war on France and Russia. But right at the outset of this war, there are a few key major factors. For one thing, when Germany moves troops through Belgium, just like in our timeline, they went in with the assumption of the British won't honor this alliance, it won't be worth it to them. And in this scenario, due to the recent war with relatively recent war with France and Russia, the British won't be willing to go to war over it. They'll let Germany move troops through Belgium in an effort to attack France. The other key major fact is that in our timeline, Italy refused to join the Central Powers, citing that it was an offensive war. However, this was really not the reason. It was more so that they just didn't have faith in the Central Powers' ability to win the war. Italy was quite an opportunistic empire, which was proved by the fact that just 4 years previously in the Italo-Turkish War, they had gone to war with the Ottoman Empire in an attempt to seize Libya from them. And in our timeline, they joined the Entente against the Central Powers because in the Treaty of London, they were promised a number of Austro-Hungarian lands that they desired. So in this timeline, the Central Powers is looking a whole lot stronger because the Entente Cordiale doesn't have the British Empire in it, which is, I think it's arguable that the British Empire was probably one of the most key important players of the early First World War. And so in this scenario, Italy joins the Central Powers. And right off the bat, because of the fact that the British troops are not there holding the front, the French defense completely collapses, which makes sense because in our timeline, the French barely held out even with massive British support. And so Paris is reached and it's occupied. And probably either what'll happen next is either France completely collapses or eventually the front stagnates outside of France. For this, we'll be saying that France, the white peace is signed with France for the time being, or not a white peace, but it comes to a stalemate, at which point the war in Russia proceeds much as it did in our timeline, with German troops pushing all the way to Baltics, Austro-Hungarian troops backing them up, and Russia would, just like in our time, collapse due to internal stressors, at which point a treaty similar to Brest-Litovsk would be signed, which would have the effects of territorial concessions to Turkey, the establishment of Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Baltic states, which would be under heavy German influence, and an independent Poland with much smaller borders than in our timeline, as Austria and Germany would not be willing to cede the land necessary to create a fully formed Poland. And at this point, the war would be pretty much over for France. They'd have no other allies. Russia had been knocked out of the war. It'd be a very swift world war. And what would happen most likely from the end of the treaty would be France would have to pay reparations, but not as hefty as in our timeline, because this was a very quick war. They would most likely lose Tunisia, Djibouti, and Savoy/Nice to Italy. And that was because Italy actually had a large amount of Italians in those provinces of France, Savoy and Nice. However, they had to cede them into France when they formed as part of an agreement. And Djibouti and Tunisia would most likely go to Italy because Italy had interest in expanding in Africa. And the two were logical steps for Italian expansion into French colonies. A pro-Austrian government would be installed in Serbia. Brest-Litovsk would be enacted in Eastern Europe. The Caucasus would break away, and we'll explain why, and they'd probably fall under German influence. And finally, all of sub-Saharan Africa, that was at least at war with Germany. So the Belgian Congo, French Cameroon, French Gabon would be annexed into the German colonies there, like Tanzania. And this is because Germany actually had pre-existing ambitions, even in our timeline, to establish a colony called Middle Africa, which spanned, the middle of Africa. It is worth mentioning the Portuguese colonies, which in our time were meant to be included, are not included in this because Britain doesn't join the war and hence never pulls in Portugal. Um, afterwards, now we're reaching full alternative history. Just like in our timeline, the Russian government most likely collapsed with a provisional government taking place, and the Bolsheviks then rising up and the Russian Civil War happened. Most likely, the French government would also collapse because, to be fair, they weren't that stable. In 1871, after the formation of Germany, they had only just undergone another revolution, which brought them back to republic. So it most likely collapsed into maybe a small civil war. And in this time, Japan would probably seize some of France's remaining colonies in Asia. And this is where our discussion begins.
All right.
So you didn't mention America much. I'm curious to hear what you think would happen with them.
So this war takes place relatively early on, and American public probably wouldn't have much of a perception of the war at all. Because, for one thing, it happened so quickly. And for the other, one of the reasons why the American public and hence the nation itself was so swayed against the Central Powers, at least later on, public perception was brought up against the Central Powers, was that the British did a very good job of creating propaganda, creating scenarios, and making the Germans look bad. But this war happened so quickly, maybe a few years tops, that America never gets time to join and most likely never has motive to join without the British, sort of pushing them in the quote unquote right direction.
I have another thing I want to talk about America. Did America have the number one economy before the war started or after the war ended?
So this is a common misconception of America assuming economic, at least GDP wise, annual GDP, it's oftentimes thought that America reached this in the 20s, but no, America had achieved the leading annual GDP by 1890. Well, at least GDP wasn't calculated back then, but that's what economists estimate. America, if what you're trying to ask is, was America production a big producer and a major player? They were at this point. They were a major player.
Yes, but
And you don't think? Go ahead.
okay, but wouldn't because they supplied most of their supplies to Great Britain, right, during the war, I believe.
Well, they
And then
weren't giving the supplies to Britain like in the Second World War
they were
under
like selling
Lend-Lease.
them.
They were selling weapons to probably both sides of this war. They don't really have any reason to sell just to the British.
Oh, okay.
I mean, well, British ships wouldn't allow, they turned away American vessels trying to sell guns to the Germans. But in this scenario, the German Navy probably is on par, if not stronger than France's Navy. So American ships probably wouldn't have much trouble sending weapons to both sides of the war.
Okay, so they still profit off this war.
Yeah, they'd profit probably to a smaller extent off of it because it's just a much smaller war. But yes.
And you don't think that they'd be concerned with Germany's growing power at all?
I mean, probably post-war, maybe a little bit, but for the most part, it didn't really affect them. The American public's main problem with Germany was their attack on Belgium, but that was a relatively small thing that was embellished by British propaganda accounts. I really think that America would stick to its isolationist policy, especially under Woodrow Wilson, who was a pro-isolationist president, at least within geopolitical affairs. He got involved in Western Hemisphere politics to a certain extent, but he was much more isolationist than his predecessors of William Taft and Theodore Roosevelt.
I see.
So what do you think would happen if America joined the war?
Well, I don't think they would have, but assuming for some reason they were a member of the Entente Cordiale, I think that Germany still would have reached Paris really quickly. I mean, America's standing army was pitiful, and that's not an exaggeration. At the time, the American standing army was smaller than that of Romania. It
Well,
was, yeah, it wasn't a Now, of course, they would have made an economic impact, but that really only helped in a long-term war of attrition, where the industry is actually able to kick in and provide these guns. But France would be knocked out so quickly that I just don't think they'd be able to make much of a difference. But we are getting to a certain extent off track with an alternate history within an alternate history.
Yeah. I would like to ask, so earlier you brought up, not in this podcast, but that the Nazis wouldn't become a thing, communism would be much less of an influence over the world. Would you like to detail what?
Yeah. I think the post-war conditions of World War One, which led to such a radical group being able to seize control in Germany, such as the Nazis, would not be present after World War One, would which in this timeline would be relatively small, and so the economic impact of it would be sizable, but not as much as in our timeline. Germany would come out on top, and just the conditions, they'd probably be relatively prosperous, at least at first after the war. Now, the nation, which I think would suffer from instability, well, the nations, plural, after this war would be France and Russia. Especially so Russia, because um, the Russian Civil War in this scenario is already taking place while the treaty is being signed, just like in our timeline.
well, couldn't a party similar to the Nazi Party grow in a place like France or Russia?
Well, that's something that I think is interesting because I think with France, there would be revolution because France, keep in mind, had only undergone revolution. Like, so this is 19, let's say 1916, 1917, 1871. So, like 40 something years prior to this, right? So they weren't exactly. So this French Republic, which currently existed, was not exactly on particularly stable ground. Well, it was compared to some nations, but it it wasn't exactly a long-standing government like Britain's or France's, or like Britain or the United States. Um, but I think what would happen is most likely German troops, just like in the 1871 war, would remain in control of Paris and assist whatever faction in France was the least radical. So what would end up happening is we'd probably see a conservative republic installed in France by Germany, right? Russia is a completely different story, though. I think that the Red Army might struggle more, especially since, unlike the Entente militaries, the German military, the Germans weren't going to demilitarize after the war. They'd probably be willing, and also they'd be less worn out after the war. So they'd probably be more willing to invest larger amounts of resources into assisting the White Army of Russia against the Bolsheviks. But I feel like the Bolsheviks still might have the upper hand unless full-on German military intervention took place.
So you do think like a new power would form?
I think that Soviet Russia would form.
I see.
Emphasis, I say Soviet Russia, not the Soviet Union, because they wouldn't it might still be called the Soviet Union because they still have Kazakhstan, but the Soviet Union would or Soviet Russia would not be able to reintegrate Belarus and Ukraine back into their nation, so to speak, as they did in our timeline, because Ukraine and Belarus are both under the German sphere of influence, probably occupied by German troops, and Germany would not stand for that. And Russia would, having just recovered from a civil war, would not be in a situation where they'd be able to oppose the German Empire at what is right now its peak.
Okay.
I do think this is interesting.
Also,
Um,
oh sorry.
because I don't think nuclear weapons would have developed in this scenario because there wouldn't be any reason to develop nuclear weapons, right? Because the only reason in World War II, uh, that they developed nuclear weapons is to like they were like having some sort of like nuclear race, right? To see who could
Well,
finish
who's to
first because
say
they were
that
both.
another conflict wouldn't occur in
Oh
this
yeah, that's
universe?
yeah, that is true. But I feel like it's because World War II was so major that there
Also,
was
I mean,
reason to
I
actually develop
believe
nuclear
that
weapons.
some nuclear research took
Yeah,
place
but I
in the
think
U.S. prior to World War II even beginning.
that
Let me just verify that.
yeah.
Uh, hmm. Well, I'm not sure right now. We'll do more research into it. I don't want to hold up the podcast any longer with this, but I think Andy might be right. That if there isn't another conflict, nuclear weapons would probably take much longer to develop.
Yeah.
So you think an age of prosperity would come through?
And this is another thing which is difficult to predict, right? There could be economic recessions that we don't know about, which lead to geopolitical situations which cause nations to collapse. Um, it'd certainly be the post-war period, at least at first, would certainly be prosperous for the German Empire. Same for the United States. Two nations which would later join the Central Powers. For this scenario, we'd assume the Ottomans would also join the Central Powers. That's something I forgot to mention, but I just wanted to bring it up. Uh, Two nations which would not prosper during this era would be the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottomans. And the Austrians were already struggling before the war, but I think unless they made some major reforms and adapted a system which was proposed by Archduke Franz Ferdinand before he was shot, was something called the United States of Austria, which basically suggested um, all the different groups of Austria-Hungary receiving their own autonomous states. But I don't know if that would be adapted after the war. But if it wasn't, Austria-Hungary most likely would not survive.
Well, what kind of like tensions would we be looking at in this situation? I mean,
So
after the war ends.
at least within Austria-Hungary, it's probably you're going to have to a certain extent Bohemians and the Slovaks wanting independence. Maybe the Hungarians, but let's assume optimistically here that the Austrians and the Hungarians are working together in this because Hungary wants to preserve their territory in Slovakia and Transylvania. We're looking at increased Serbian nationalism and Southern Slavic nationalism in southern Austria-Hungary, which would only be exacerbated by the fact that Austria-Hungary had just um, created a Serbian client state. But the resentment against the government there, it existed before the war, and it would most definitely exist after it. You'd have the Polish and Ukrainians in Galicia, Lodomeria, that would most likely try to break away. Romanians in Transylvania that would try and break away. And I just don't think, unless the Germans stepped in, to assist Austria-Hungary, that they would be able to keep their empire together unless they adopted the United States of Austria-Hungary. All right. So the next thing I think that'd be interesting to discuss is the results after the breakup of Austria-Hungary, B, how the Ottomans would do, and C, how did the British feel about this new German-dominated European order? Because this is exactly what they feared would come to pass. So wrapping up with Austria-Hungary, most likely what would happen is that the empire would break apart. There'd be breakaway states which look roughly similar to ours today. Hungary might possess more of Slovakia and some more parts of Transylvania, since it'd probably be more organic breakup that wouldn't be intervened in by the Western powers. So it'd be more organic and probably more along ethnic lines. Serbia would probably manage to annex Bosnia, maybe even Croatia and Slovenia, if we're being optimistic, and create a greater state of Serbia or a Yugoslavian state. Um, and Galicia Lodomeria would probably be annexed into the German client states of Poland and Ukraine, respectively. Transylvania would probably, for the most part, be ceded to Romania. The next thing that I think is really interesting is how did the Ottoman Empire do? Because after World War I, the Ottoman Empire got broken up by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But that being said, it was already collapsing to begin with. So for one thing, the stressors which caused Ottoman decline, well, not Ottoman decline, it was already in decline at this point for a long time. But the stressors which lead to full-on breakdown of the empire are not present in this scenario. The Arab revolts don't take place because the war is so quick that, frankly, I don't think they'd have time to revolt, and the British would not be backing them either. But that being said, the Ottoman Empire would still struggle. The Arab nationalism against the Turks would still be present, and the empire's problems wouldn't disappear. One thing which I think might actually help the Ottomans is if they did manage to pass through reforms, which left the Arabs of the nation feeling a little less alienated. And another thing is if they survived long enough till major discovery of oil deposits in Iraq, that could also be a big boon for them because Germany would most likely be a large customer of Ottoman produced oil. So I think it's really difficult to predict, but being optimistic, the Ottoman Empire would probably not expand in any major way, but it would, being optimistically assuming they'd be able to maintain some form of status quo, maybe by creating like a dominion in Arabia and exploiting the oil deposits which would form in Iraq. But then the big thing that I think is important to discuss, at least within Europe, there are other more global impacts that form because of this. But the big European impact, and arguably global, is Britain. Global because, if you control a quarter of the globe, affairs relating to you will always be global. How do you guys think Britain would react to this? To this new German-dominated Europe?
I want to say something about a little prior to this, actually, like during World War One when this was all happening. I feel like if because they really feared like a German-dominated Europe, right? I feel like seeing that Germany was making these huge, like, I guess, wins in Europe, like taking Paris and being able to defeat Russia, I feel like the British would get involved at some point in time.
I don't necessarily agree, because the government needed the pretext to get involved in the war, and they passed that up when they didn't declare war on Germany after they occupied Belgium. they couldn't just suddenly declare war on Germany a few years after they occupied Belgium. And the other thing to keep in mind is that this is a relatively quick war, so I don't think that it would be. I think it would be over and done with probably too quickly for the British to react in any major way.
Well, you say you put a lot of emphasis on major. What are you thinking in terms of minor?
Mm, I mean, I think to the same extent that you saw American favoritism of the Entente, you might see British favoritism of trading with the French and the Russians. I mean, they don't like the French or Russians in this scenario, but they like them a whole lot more than they do the Germans. But that being said, I think that they would probably not contribute in any major way, but probably favor the two, offer the two loans. They probably play a supporting role similar to America did to the Entente, not really being involved or even giving them weapons, just sort of.
Sorry, Bo,
But
your audio cut out and for like the in like the
oh, I did.
last 10 seconds. Yeah, you went quiet for you.
Oh, I said I don't think that they'd get involved in a major way. They just play like a supporting role, as in the sense that they wouldn't give weapons to them. They just do business with them.
All right. Do you think the
So,
Um,
the Germans won't like that and then they'll declare war? Or are they? Oh, I guess they
no,
no. They'd
that
want to
would
avoid a
be.
conflict. They'd want to avoid a conflict with Germany. I guess.
Yeah, Kaiser Wilhelm was belligerent, but I don't think even he would want to, because Germany had no way of landing troops in France, in Britain, I mean. And that's part of what makes this scenario interesting, right? It's a very clean cut war. The French would probably, the French and the Russians were in a state where they're weak enough to both surrender quickly. It's not like World War II where Russia's strong and and Britain's involved. This is a very clean cut war where Russia quickly collapses, so does France likewise.
well, don't you think Britain would be annoyed at the Germans for moving troops, even if they didn't decide to join the war because of it?
Oh, of course they'd be annoyed. They most definitely would not like Germany. The two would have very cold relations across the channel, especially if the British had concerns over German colonial expansion into French territories and German involvement with the Ottoman Empire, who was quote unquote in the British sphere to a certain extent. Um, I don't know if they'd come to conflict, and if they did, what would be the spark for that. But most definitely, the two empires would not be on good terms.
And they did come to conflict. Uh, who do you think would prevail?
Well, that's difficult to say. I mean, I think it comes down to neither side would be able to effectively land troops on others' mainland. So I think it just comes down to do the Germans continue the naval buildup after the First World War? Assuming they do, then the Germans would probably be able to blockade the British Isles, and the British would not only be able to import the resources they desperately needed to fight a conflict and feed their people, but they wouldn't be able to export to colonies and make sure the colonies stood in order. And the empire would probably just crumble. The Germans could just blockade the British Isles, not allow any ships to enter or leave, and just watch the British Empire crumble.
And you don't think the British Navy could do anything about that?
I mean, the British Navy would be big, but we're talking a German Empire, peak production capability, with almost all of Europe at its disposal, as well as new colossal colonies in Africa. I just think it'd be very difficult for the British. I mean, as it stood, when World War I broke out, the German Navy was almost on par with the British Navy, right? And they managed to build a navy equivalent to that of the British in 40 years, right? And that was while they were growing. And the British had a precedent before that of total naval dominance for hundreds of years preceding that. And the fact that they could be so closely rivaled by the Germans even before they reached this height that they were currently at in a period of like 40 years speaks volumes to how well the Germans would be able to compete with them, at least on a naval production uh, terms of speaking, with all these new assets in Europe, with their quote unquote buff to their power.
But with the German Empire growing this much and now contesting the British Empire, don't you think that like alliances would start forming against them in fears of being taken over?
I think to a certain extent there would be. I think America would probably align itself with Britain, especially as they grow in significance and Woodrow Wilson ends his presidency. Um, the Soviet Union would be mostly alienated from politics abroad. Although something that's interesting is that maybe the Soviet Union wouldn't even form. Because the reason why the Soviet Union formed is because Bolshevik figures, Lenin was shipped from Switzerland to Russia by Germany. But in a scenario where Germany quickly wins, Lenin is never shipped over to Russia. So perhaps the Bolsheviks don't take control. Perhaps Russia remains a moderate socialist republic. In which case, the availability for an alliance between them and Britain remains open. Go on, sorry.
I would like to just point out the Entente, or at least the alliance between France and Russia, was formed because of Germany, right? Because they wanted to it was like a pact against Germany, right?
It was basically not necessarily, but it was
But that was
definitely
its
it
intended
wasn't
purpose,
probably
right?
exclusively, but when the two were agreeing to the alliance, they probably had Germany in mind.
All right. So I think probably something similar would happen between Britain and America with their alliance, right?
In America, potentially even Russia, assuming that the provisional government manages to hold on. Because
Yeah.
I completely failed to consider before we started talking about the scenario that the Bolsheviks would never be brought back to Russia. Bolsheviks simply wouldn't be there. I mean, you'd have some Bolshevik figures like Trotsky, but Trotsky wasn't a traditional Bolshevik until after the provisional government was established. So the only proper Bolshevik you had in Russia would be Stalin, and he didn't have enough popularity to gain popular support until Lenin takes over. So I don't think that the Bolsheviks would be able to take control in Russia. So what sort of government do you guys think would form in Russia? And this contributes to whether or not they would join this British faction against Germany.
Was the provisional government a socialist government?
I don't know. That's what we're the provisional. Oh no, the provisional government which formed in real life was just a coalition. Alexander Kerensky was the president, was most definitely not a socialist. There were a lot of left wing movements in it, like the Mensheviks, though. But the Mensheviks weren't too crazy radical. I think they'd definitely be willing to negotiate with the West and work with the British.
All right. Yeah, I don't think the Bolsheviks would come to power, but they had that whole revolution because of workers' rights, right? Because they were living in poverty. Then we're getting paid. The nobles had way too much money, right?
Well,
So they
keep
get
in
rid of
mind the first revolution was against the Tsardom, in which the provisional government was established. After that, a revolution took place because the provisional government continued to stay at war with Germany. At which point the Civil War broke out. But I think the provisional government in this scenario might be able to hold on to the reins of power if the Bolsheviks aren't there, destabilizing the condition. Furthermore, the war wouldn't continue because it'd be over so quickly. So the provisional government might be able to stabilize the situation quicker. What's your guys' take on this?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not too sure about Russia's political state at this point. I don't know if they would adopt
Oh, it's
socialism.
a mess to be sure. it's all over the place. You've got such a broad spectrum of people involved in the provisional government. You have obviously your moderates, probably with Kerensky, who's in charge. You're going to have your far right wingers who want to bring back some form of monarchy. You're going to have probably a liberal party, a socialist, the Menshevik Socialist Party, which would probably be similar to one of the democratic socialist, no, social democrat parties that we see in Europe today. Um, and then finally some far left wing communist faction which would emerge. Most likely, what would probably happen is that a coalition between moderates, conservatives, and liberals would form, at least until the nation stabilized.
Do they
Well,
hold
I mean,
elections?
They'd probably hold an election with the moderates, with, well, I say moderates, but Kerensky, conservatives, and liberals all pooling in their votes under Kerensky, under Alexander Kerensky.
well, if that's happening, wouldn't there be a good opportunity for a figure to try and take power based off of like propaganda against a specific people? I mean, isn't
In
that where we'd
Russia,
see? Yeah.
potentially. Now, that's an interesting possibility. I mean, Kerensky wasn't particularly well liked, and I think he'd be able to maintain power at first, but that's interesting because there probably might be some radical movement. But the first thing we need to decide for this scenario is this movement left wing or right wing in character? Assumingly, it probably has some sort of revanchist intent of restoring Russian territories into Ukraine and Belarus and restoring former Russian glory. But at this point, I think honestly, it comes up to I guess our decision because it's difficult to say what sort of movement would take place. If I had to guess, I'd probably say it'd be more left leaning. But what do you guys think?
Well, why do you say left leaning?
Uh, Probably because Russia as a whole had bad experiences with with monarchy and traditional conservatism. And, and part of the reasons why these extreme right wing groups were able to take control is that when they were smaller and more innocuous at first, they were part of just broader right wing coalitions, and they used that to work their way into power. But I think at least for a bit, any form of right wing conservatism would be undermined by the fact that the monarchists would be part of it. So I think the left wingers and more radical left wing movements, and even moderate left wing movements like the Mensheviks, would probably not struggle. They'd probably have less of a struggle gaining traction in Russia.
I
Yeah.
see what you're saying. But I mean, don't you think like left wing had treated them in badly in the past too?
Not yet. Keep in mind, this is Russian Revolution. The second Russian Revolution never happened. The Bolsheviks never assumed power. So the people of Russia still have not ever had an experience with Bolshevism and communism. And I mean, even under the Stalinist regime, some of the people in Russia proper approved of it.
So you think because of their bad experiences with monarchy and like single rule, you think that a left hand
There
power
might
would
be, yeah, like an almost overcompensation, like a swing in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Or alternatively, the moderates could maintain control, and something like social democrats or probably Russia being a less more agrarian, heavily religious nation, probably moderate conservatives would also be a strong possibility for a ruling party.
Mm. Well, in this situation where this left radical group appears. I mean, what's their goal? What do they tell the nation?
Well, probably something like probably something similar along the lines of the Bolshevik phrase of land, peace, and bread. They'll make a bunch of promises, like all political groups do, regardless of leaning left, right, being radical or not. They'll make promises to the people, and they'll probably have a certain revanchist character to them. Maybe, probably promising to reclaim territory in the Ukraine and Caucasus. And this is an interesting scenario because we don't know how this would affect Russian industry and if they'd be able to industrialize as effectively and bring Russia to a state of international importance that Stalin was able to do. Because regardless of our take on Stalin as a not so great person, it's undeniable that despite his methods being quite draconian, they were effective, even if they resulted in the deaths of many, many, many Ukrainians and Russians too. But the whole Holodomor certainly was more damaging for the Ukrainians. Apologies if I said that wrong. So this will conclude our episode of the podcast today. We've come to a consensus that we do want to keep this. We do want to try and achieve some level of consistency of the lengths of our podcast. We'll see if we'll be able to follow through on that, though. However, we will be making a second episode on this because there's still a lot to talk about. We have the chaotic political situation of Russia, the growing anti-German pact, as well as we haven't delved into the German alliance itself as well as the Great Depression, and we didn't talk extensively about events outside of Europe and North America. So we definitely want to touch down upon that in the next scenario. So that will, for the most part, conclude this episode. If you have any questions or you have any recommendations or you want to correct any mistakes we made, we will eventually be setting up an email. Wait, we've set up the email, right?
Yes, I have set up
We
the
plugged the
email.
email.
I have set up the email. Yes.
I give them the email address they can contact if
Yeah, I'll put the
we've
email.
made a mistake.
I'll put the email address in the description. You can contact us for any questions
That's
you
a
may
link
have,
in the description.
any comments you may have about the video, or any suggestions you may have for future podcast topics. Anything is welcome.
We're all ears. Isaac, do you have any closing comments?
Well, I mean, I'd like to thank you guys a lot for having me on this. It was very interesting to talk and consider these different situations that could occur in this alternate history.
All right. Excellent.
Okay, well, thank
I'll
you.
see y'all later.